Hi, welcome to the Where to Start lecture video. This is what we're going to cover today. It's the research loop. I'll walk you through the whole research process. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about hypotheses in a little bit more detail. I will, at the end, point you in the direction of some APA format handouts, and then in class we'll work on the in-class practice and lab 2. So this whole course is really about two things. The first is acquiring new knowledge. So this is doing the research yourself, or being a producer of new knowledge. And the second is evaluating knowledge. So being able to read it and critique it, being a good consumer. So the whole first half of the class is really going to focus on that second one, evaluating new knowledge. And then we won't get to producing our own research until the second half of the semester. You may remember from the last lecture that there are three kind of main sources of knowledge. We have intuition, authority, empiricism. And I said that each of these had an accepted role in scientific knowledge. Okay, we talked about how intuition and authority can't necessarily be trusted particularly for scientific information. Okay, but that doesn't mean that we can't use them at all in the scientific process. So actually all three of these are really good for generating ideas. Okay, they can be a source of hypotheses. But the only one that we should trust when it comes to actual knowledge in science is empiricism. Some other sources of ideas include, like I mentioned, common sense, intuition, authority, but also observation of personal and social events. So you may be out at a restaurant and observe some behavior around you, and that may lead to an idea for some research project and a hypothesis. Other good sources of ideas include theories. So I don't think we had a chance to talk about this last time, but there's a big difference between theories and hypotheses in the scientific world. In the general population, you may hear these words used interchangeably, but they actually mean two very different things. So a hypothesis is a prediction, whereas a theory is a body of ideas that explain and organize factual information. Okay, so you may have heard, your buddy says, oh, I have a theory why my dog is acting that particular way. What they really mean is they have a hypothesis or a prediction. Okay, theories are supported by a whole body of research. Okay, again, factual information that's organized together, and then these can be used to generate new knowledge and can be modified with new research. You can also use practical problems in the real world as a source of idea for research. Remember we talked about basic versus applied research last time. And then also reading previous research can give you ideas. Okay, we'll be focusing later on this past research aspect, this particular source of ideas. So I mentioned earlier that we're going to go through what I call the research loop. This is the process of research from start to finish. You'll see up in the top left corner, you start with the library research, and then you make your way down around the right, okay, in a clockwise manner. This slide is on Blackboard for you. That way you don't have to draw in your notes. Okay, so the top left, library research, we have to know what is already known. From there we can form hypotheses. Then we actually design the study, then carry it out and collect the data. And remember, in between these two, we'll be talking next time about ethics and the step that goes in between these two. After data collection comes data analysis, then hypothesis testing, and then drawing conclusions. And researchers apply this same loop over and over in three kind of main ways. First is to test a brand new research hypothesis or a novel research hypothesis. So you'll see here, whenever I write RH, I mean research hypothesis. Okay, so this is the first test of a hypothesis using the best design that the researcher can come up with. Then there's replication. Okay, so here we can make sure that our conclusions about a particular research hypothesis are accurate by repeating the same research design. And the main purpose is to get confidence in our methods, our data, and our conclusions. And then the last way we can apply this is through convergent research, or extension. And this is using some variations of the research design. So maybe we change just the population, use a different age group of participants, or maybe we change just the setting, or we use a different measure or a different task. And the main purpose of these kind of extension studies or these convergent research is to test how generalizable our results are. So what changes do we make to the design lead to different results, or do we find more support for the same hypothesis? Okay, so we're going to start in that top left corner with library research. And remember that you don't have to write these things down word for word. Okay, so library research, we have to have a good picture about the current knowledge, what we already know about this particular behavior that you want to study. This entails knowing what the hypotheses are that have already been tested, the types of research designs used to test those hypotheses. Okay, so certain research fields may have particular designs that they tend to use, and that's important to know. You must know the statistical analyses that were done. So again, particular research fields may have certain analyses that get used that maybe you weren't aware about before. And then also we must understand how these were combined to get the conclusions that make up our current knowledge. So at this point, as a researcher or as someone who wants to be a critical consumer of research, it's not enough just to read the studies and be able to kind of summarize the findings or kind of spit back a general summary. We have to be able to understand how all of these things combine and be able to critique them. Okay, so doing this well requires the ability to identify relevant research. Okay, so we're going to actually work on this in lab. So you're going to develop some literature search skills, and then you have to be able to read that literature critically and properly evaluate it. Okay, so evaluating the research methods, evaluating the statistics that are used, and so on. And we'll learn those skills over the next several labs. Okay, the next step is hypothesis formation. Here you identify some educated guess or prediction about what new knowledge you propose to identify with your research. Okay, and the important thing here is you have to be able to trace how you got to that hypothesis. What led you to coming up with that particular prediction? Okay, so this is why doing that library research first, being able to show or demonstrate why that hypothesis makes sense is critical. Okay, so this is all based on having a very thorough understanding of what's already known and how it was learned, and then proposing some new knowledge. Okay. The research hypotheses, we're going to go over a few types, and these correspond with the goals of research methods or the goals of behavioral science research in general. So we're first going to go over those goals, and then I'll come back to the different types of hypotheses. So the four main goals of behavioral science are listed here for you. So 1 is to describe behavior, 2 is to predict behavior, 3 is to determine causes of behavior, and 4 is to explain behavior. Okay, so these are our hierarchy, meaning that if no one has yet described the behavior, then you cannot predict or determine causes or explain. Okay, but this does not mean that a researcher has to go in this particular order. One researcher may be focusing on predictions, so as long as some other researcher has already described that particular behavior, that person can do that. Okay, so we'll go through these one at a time with some examples. So describing behavior involves very careful observation and record keeping. And there's a few types of methods that allow this. One are case studies. Okay, a technique in which one person or a very small group is studied in depth to get at some underlying behavioral principles. These usually are very lengthy, very detailed. Okay, then there's self-report report or survey methods. So this is where you ask the people questions and you record their responses on things like their attitudes, opinions, or behaviors. Usually done by getting a representative random sample of people to answer the survey questions. And then there's naturalistic observation. This is watching and recording the behavior of organisms in their natural environment. So this doesn't necessarily mean out in a forest, although it can. For humans, it can mean in the home, on the trolley, just anywhere where a person would be naturally behaving. Okay, so in class, later in the semester, we're not going to get to case studies because, again, they're very detailed and in-depth. We don't have time for that, but we will be getting some practice with surveys and observation techniques. The second goal is predicting behavior. Okay, so when two events are related and we regularly observe them together, okay, we can then make predictions. So for example, scores on the graduate record exam, the GRE, these tests that you take to get into graduate school. Those scores are related to success in graduate school. That success can be measured by graduation rates or grades or so on. So if these two things are related, we should be able to predict one from the other, meaning we can look at people's GRE scores before they've even gone into graduate school, and we can predict who is going to be successful and who may need additional resources. Right, that third goal of behavioral research is determining causes. So this is exploring cause and effect relationships. Right? And one thing to keep in mind is just because two things are related does not mean that one is caused by the other. So remember that little saying from your stats class, you've probably heard it over and over again. Correlation does not equal causation. All right, so there's three things that we need in order to determine causes, and we'll go into this in way more detail a little bit later in the semester. One is temporal precedence. This is just a fancy way of saying that the cause comes before the effect. The other is covariation of cause and effect. So when the cause is present, the effect occurs, and when the cause is not present, the effect does not occur. Okay. And then the last is to rule out all alternative explanations. Okay. So there should be no other variable involved that could be causing that effect. Now there's only one research design that can be used to test causal or cause and effect relationships, and that is an experiment. And there's no need to put this in your notes. We'll go over experimental design more later in the class. But here we just have a basic experimental design. We have a sample of participants over here on the left. Then we randomly assign them to two conditions. Here we have an experimental group and a control group. Remember, this is your independent variable, and this is the only thing that should be different between the participants. And then at the end, we measure the same dependent variable from everyone, and then we statistically compare those two groups. Okay. There's a lot more that goes into research design, or specifically experimental design, than that. We'll go over it later. But this is the only type of method that can be used to determine cause and effect relationships. And that last goal of behavioral science is explaining behavior. So why does this particular behavior occur? What this does is combine all of the other research findings together to try and come up with some sort of explanation, and usually leads to other questions. Okay, so we're going to jump back into research hypotheses now. Okay. And regardless of the type of hypothesis, all hypotheses must be testable and falsifiable. Testable means that there must be some way to collect the data to actually evaluate and test the research hypothesis. So there's a few things that could limit how testable a hypothesis is. First thing is insufficient technology. There's some things we just can't study because we don't have the technology to do so. Okay, so we can think back not too long in the history of behavioral science research. People may have had hypotheses or been interested in studying the activity of the brain while doing particular tasks. But before brain imaging was invented and more available, people could not actually test those hypotheses. Right? The other thing that could limit our testability is ethics. So there are some things that we've decided we shouldn't study. Okay. For instance, if we were interested in reducing poverty, okay, and we thought, well, if we allowed young children to work and bring home money to their family, we might be able to reduce poverty. Well, here in the United States, young children are not allowed to work. This is all based on ethics, and so we would not actually be able to test that out and carry out that study. The third kind of limit to testability is resources. So maybe the technology exists to perform the study and it's allowed, via ethics, but that particular researcher can't afford to carry out that study. Okay, so for example, if I was interested in doing brain imaging with marmosets, I don't have an fMRI machine, I don't have the millions of dollars to buy one, I don't have access to one, so for me, any hypothesis relating to brain imaging would be untestable. But that same hypothesis may be testable for someone else who does have access to those materials and resources. And the other aspect of research hypotheses is that they must be falsifiable, meaning that there's a possibility that the hypothesis is wrong. Okay, so remember, we're going to test the hypothesis, so the outcomes should either be it's supported or it's not supported. Okay, so if we come up with this really basic research hypothesis, practice improves performance. Okay, that could be supported by the data or it could be not supported by the data, so it's falsifiable. But if we word it like practice either improves performance or it doesn't, there's no way to actually show that that's incorrect or show that it's not supported. Okay, so wording of the hypothesis is very important. Like you see in the cartoon here, I've narrowed it down to two hypotheses: it grew or we shrunk. Okay, you have to be very specific in the prediction, and again, it has to be falsifiable. The data should be able to show either it's supported or not supported. Okay, there's three different kinds of hypotheses that we're going to talk about: attributive, associative, and causal. We'll go through all three, and as I describe them, just be sure to notice that there's the same kind of hierarchical arrangement among these three types of hypotheses as there are among the behavioral goals. Okay, so attributive corresponds to the describing behavior, associative predicting behavior, and causal is that determining causes goal. Okay, so we'll start with an attributive hypothesis. This type states that a behavior exists, it can be measured, and it can be distinguished from other similar behaviors. Okay, this type is a univariate hypothesis, meaning that there is only one variable involved. And in order to support a hypothesis like this, the researcher needs to demonstrate some sort of technique that allows properly trained researchers to reliably record and score the particular behavior of interest. Okay, so this corresponds with that describing behavior goal. Okay, so for example, we could be interested in the number of acts of aggression shown at dog parks. Okay, again here there's only one variable involved, and that's aggression. And so a researcher would need to come up with a reliable way to record and score acts of aggression while observing dogs at dog parks. Okay, or we may be interested in the motor skills of 8-month-old infants. And again, the researcher would need to come up with a reliable way to record and score the motor behaviors that are displayed. The next type, the associative hypotheses, these state that a relationship exists between two behaviors. So knowing the amount or kind of one behavior helps you to then predict the amount or kind of the other behavior. So since there's two behaviors involved, or two variables, this is a bivariate hypothesis. So on top of being able to reliably score and record the behaviors of interest, we also here have to show that there is a reliable statistical relationship between those two variables. Okay, so for example, we may be interested in studying television watching and obesity, and we may have a prediction that as children increase their TV watching, their weight increases. Or we may have a prediction or a hypothesis that says income level is correlated with visits to Disneyland. So the higher the family's income, the more visits to Disneyland they make. Again, two variables involved, and we can predict behaviors from these relationships. So some keywords to look out for when trying to identify it as an associative hypothesis. If it says associated or related or correlated or any extension of those words, that is a key right there that it's an associative hypothesis. And you can also look for the words tend to or tends to. The last type we're going to talk about are causal hypotheses. These state that one behavior, one variable, causes some sort of change in another. Okay, so differences in the amount or kind of one behavior cause differences in the amount or kind of the other behavior. So again, there's two behaviors or two variables here, so it's a bivariate hypothesis. The evidence we need to support, again, we still have to be able to record and score the behaviors that we're interested in. We also have to demonstrate a statistical relationship like with the associative hypotheses. But on top of that, we have to have temporal precedence that I mentioned earlier, so cause comes before the effect. And we have to eliminate all other alternative explanations. Okay, so the only research design that can test a causal hypothesis is an experiment, like I mentioned earlier. Okay, so McDonald's may be interested in increasing their Big Mac sales, and they want to know if this ad changes the amount of Big Macs that are sold. Okay, so they could randomly assign this particular ad to certain zip codes, and the other random zip codes get the control ad, and then afterwards they can measure how many Big Macs are sold in each of those zip codes. Some of the key terms to look out for when trying to identify a causal hypothesis: obviously the word cause, produce, create, change, influence, increases, decreases, improves. Those are all kind of causal language. All right, so what I'm going to have you do now is identify in your notes each type of research hypothesis below. Okay, you don't need to write the full hypothesis or question out, but if you want to, you can. Just pause the video now and list if it's associative, attributive, or causal. Okay, so hopefully you paused the video and wrote those in your notes. So we'll go over the first one. Grades on exam 1 are correlated with lab grades. Those with higher lab grades tend to do better on the midterm. Okay, so this would be an associative hypothesis. So key terms to look for in there: correlated, tend to, and then also notice that there's two behaviors or two variables of interest. So grades on exam 1 and lab grades. The second one, I want to construct a score that reflects how well you did on the statistical analysis parts of your lab assignments. So this one here is attributive. There's only one variable of interest, and that's the score on the stats section. And this last one, can I improve your scores on exam 1 by grading and returning your homework assignments by the next class period? Okay, this one is causal. We think that one variable, okay, when we return the homework assignments, is going to change, and in this case we think it's going to improve the other variable, which is scores on the exam. So we're going to jump back into the research loop here. So we've covered library research in the top left, hypothesis formation, and now we're moving on to research design. Okay, so research design, again, is all based on what you already know about that particular behavior and the research that has come before. Okay, so based on all of that previous knowledge, you have to identify very specifically how you will test your hypothesis. And you have to be able to explain how these particular methods are going to provide a proper test for your particular research hypothesis. Okay, so again, doing this right depends on complete knowledge of the designs and methodologies that you read about in the literature search or the literature review. Some elements of the design that you have to make decisions about. Okay, who is the population of interest? Who do you want to study, and how will you recruit those individuals into the study? Where is the study going to take place? What are you going to actually have the participants do? Are you going to have any sort of manipulations or treat some of the participants differently than others? And exactly how will you measure or collect the data? Okay, in between this stage is an ethics review, which we'll talk about next week. But once it goes through the review and gets the okay to be carried out, then you move on to the data collection phase. Okay, so for each participant, the person is selected to be in the study somehow. Then, depending on the design, may be assigned to a particular condition or manipulation or treatment. Then they do whatever specific task in the setting under the particular conditions that you set up during the design phase, and this all results in the data. So this is the actual doing of the study, carrying it out. And you have to be careful to actually follow the methods that you set out in the prior kind of planning stage, and make sure that the way that you're collecting the data still allows for a proper test of the research hypothesis. Okay. At this point, once all of the data is collected, you can then move on to actually analyzing the data. A lot of people think that once it's collected, you can just start analyzing right away, but usually there's a whole process where you have to prepare the data for your analyses. So often data has to be scored. For example, if you took video recordings, you have to then code those video recordings into some sort of data that you can use in the analysis. So some of the data must be scored. It needs to be kind of aggregated or prepared in a way that you can input it into the statistical package that you're going to use to analyze it. All right, once it's ready, you have to make sure that you're choosing the correct analyses. So the analyses must match the type of data that you have. So hopefully in your stats class you saw a statistical decision tree. Remember where it kind of walked you through and it said if you have two variables that are both categorical, this is the test you should use. If you have two variables, one is categorical and one is numerical, this is the set of tests you can choose from. Okay, so we'll see that that'll come up again in this class. So the type of data is important, the research design is important, and the actual hypothesis you obviously have to keep in mind when you choose the analyses as well. For instance, if you're interested in comparing two groups and you set up your design that way and your research hypothesis is stated in a way that there's a comparison between two groups, running a correlation in your statistical package is not going to be a proper test of that hypothesis. This stage here is actually, with practice, a pretty simple and straightforward task. So usually students think of this as the hardest part of research because you're new to stats. It seems kind of like a foreign language. But once you start practicing and once you start using the programs repeatedly, this actually becomes probably the easiest of all of the stages in the process. Okay. It's much more difficult to evaluate the analyses that other people have used and the conclusions that other people have come up with, and also interpreting and coming up with your own conclusions from the data analysis. Okay, so moving along, after data analysis, we then have to interpret the data, which involves hypothesis testing. So here we have to combine the results of the statistical analysis. So this is the kind of output that the program gives you, all those numbers that you have to interpret. Again, the specifics of the design and how the data was collected. And again, the specific type of research hypothesis that you had. And put that all together to decide whether or not you have supported your research hypothesis. Okay, and this is a little bit more challenging than actually running the statistical analyses, but it's even more challenging when you're trying to evaluate how other people tested their hypotheses. And last, after you do this interpretation of the results, you then draw conclusions. So this involves combining the old knowledge, so everything you read about in the lit search or lit review phase, with this new knowledge from your current study. Okay, so what do we know now that we didn't know before the study was carried out? Okay, and also it's important here to reflect on the importance of this particular research. How does it fit in? Does it fit some gaps in the old knowledge? Does it contradict something in the old literature? Kind of give a so what message. Why should someone care about these particular findings? And then usually at this stage too, you decide what is next. Okay, what future studies, what follow-up studies would you want to do? What is the next research hypothesis you would want to test? This kind of finishes everything up, and you basically start the whole process over again. Okay, we have to be careful in this stage of the research process as to what we're claiming to find when we use the scientific process, when we use empiricism. Okay, I mentioned it a little bit last time, but we don't find proof and we don't find the truth with our studies. Okay, proof, you may remember from geometry, that's the only time using that word is acceptable. Okay, in research, what we do is we use probabilistic evidence. Okay, you may remember from your statistics class that all of the statistical tests are based on probabilities. Okay, P stands for probability. So you may remember that from a little ungraded stats quiz I gave you. Okay, so the statistical analysis tells us the probability that certain findings are accurate. They don't prove anything. So you want to make sure that when you're writing conclusions and when you're evaluating others, there's no mention at all of proving a hypothesis to be true or that this one particular study is conclusive. It's the be-all, end-all. No one needs to look into this hypothesis any further. Okay, so no single study is ever conclusive, and everything is based on probabilities. So if everything's based on probabilities, what do we do? How do we know what research is sound, what research is trustworthy? All right, first is to evaluate whether or not the research methods that were used are good methods, they're quality methods. Okay, have these been used successfully in previous research? Are they procedures that we know work? Okay, do we know why they work? Do these methods and procedures match up with the hypothesis that's being tested? Okay, so we use good research methods, and that gives more weight or more trustworthiness to our results. We also do replication. Remember, we repeat our research. Okay, remember, since no single finding, no single study is ever convincing, if we do multiple studies and they all show the same thing, okay, that shows us the results are replicable and the results can be more convincing and more trusted. And then we can also complete differing versions of our research. So this is sometimes called programmatic research, where we look for converging evidence. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, where we change one small aspect of the design and test it again, and this shows, again, more support for that particular hypothesis. Okay, so we're going to jump back here into the research loop. Okay, so we went through library research all the way through drawing conclusions, and at this point researchers don't just stop the study, they've finished it, they stick it in a drawer somewhere, and then never tell anyone about it. The whole point is to get that information out to other people. Okay, so at this point, once everything is completed, the researcher then tries to get that research published. And the publication process can be fairly lengthy, and it involves peer review, which I'm going to talk briefly about in just a minute. So one of the focuses of this publication process is to get the research findings out to other researchers so they can then incorporate it into their future studies. And we can also explain behavior more fully if we know what work has already been done. We can also present research at professional meetings or conferences, and this gives researchers kind of immediate feedback on their project so they can make changes if they need to. And then also, the goal is to get this information out to the general public, okay, so that people can learn more about their environment, learn more about the world around them, and behavior. Okay, so we're going to focus on this peer review process for just a minute. Okay, so focusing on peer review, I'm going to put up the basic peer review process. Now it may differ a little bit from journal to journal. But first I want to explain what peer review even is. First of all, it's an evaluation of the researcher's work by one or more people who kind of have the same competence level as the people who've produced that work. Okay, so they have to be competent, they have to be qualified, they have to be relevant to that particular field. And it's basically kind of a form of self-regulation by qualified people in that field to review and process research before it makes it to publication. Okay, so it does the kind of the same thing for science that the inspected by number 7 sticker does to your t-shirt. Okay, it provides assurance that someone who knows what they're doing has double-checked through everything and has determined that this is okay to move on and be published so everyone else can read it. All right, so this process happens most often with journal articles, although there is a peer review process for some books as well. But we're really going to focus on journal articles. There's tons and tons of journals out there, and we'll talk a little bit more about these in class together. But the researcher has to determine which journal they would like to submit to, and then follow all of the instructions for that particular journal. Okay, the article is written by the researchers that conducted the study, so they have to include an abstract, which is an overall summary of the entire study. They have an introduction, they have a method section, results, discussion, and their references. Okay, I'm sure you have seen published articles, but they all have those same basic sections. Okay, so once that is written, all of the authors on the project have to read it and agree that it's in its final form and can be submitted to a journal. And this here is the basic peer review process. You don't need to copy this into your notes. I do have a slide posted online for you that has this diagram, so you don't have to draw it out. Okay, so the researchers who did the study prepared a manuscript, okay, and they made sure that it met the specifications of the journal they were submitting to. And then they submit that to the journal. Today, this is a fairly streamlined process. It's all done online. You upload a Word document that's properly formatted to the journal specifications to their online system. And you also upload with it a statement from each of the authors saying that they are actually an author of this work and that they do approve of it being submitted. You also usually submit some sort of statement of your funding, so where did the funding come for the research, and also a statement stating that you met the ethical guidelines to carry out the research. You got approval first before you collected data, which we'll talk about next time. All right, and at this point the editor receives it and will go through, read it, and determine who they should recruit to actually review the article. So the editor is the one who oversees this whole process, who decides which articles get to be put into which printed journals, and so on. Okay, so the editor usually has a long list of people who have reviewed before, who can review in certain areas of research and so on. And so they'll contact them and ask them, do you have time to review this article if I send it to you? I would need a review by this particular date. If the person agrees, then they'll go ahead and send that on. If they don't agree, they say they won't have time to get it done, then they'll move on to another reviewer. And at this point, it goes through the peer review process. It typically is 2 or 3 individuals who read it. It's anonymous, so they don't put their name on the review, so the researcher doesn't know who it is that's actually doing the review. And oftentimes this is kind of a double-blind process where the paper is actually given to the reviewer with the author's names taken off as well. That way, who the person is doesn't influence any of the decisions. All right, and so the reviewer goes through and they're looking at quality of research. Okay, so are the methods sound, or the right statistical tests used, do the interpretation and conclusions make sense based on the results, and so on. And they'll write a fairly lengthy review, and at the end of that they will also make a recommendation to the editor on whether or not it should be published. Okay, so the editor gets all these reviews, looks through everything, and there's 3 kind of basic decisions. One, you see down here on the left, is to outright accept the publication or the manuscript as is. That is very, very rare. Okay, but if this does happen, it gets accepted. The author then works with a copy editor to fix typos and that sort of editing. It gets published usually online first and then later makes it into an actual printed journal. The most common decision is actually an outright rejection. Okay, the editor sends a letter or an email that says, sorry, we've decided not to publish your work, and that ends there. So usually for that, researchers take a little bit of time away from that project, then come back to it with fresh eyes, rethink some things, maybe they run a new analysis or rewrite some sections, and they may resubmit it to another journal. The other option, the one here in the middle, is revisions, and these can be either minor revisions or major revisions. So this is basically a conditional acceptance, where the editor says, if you make these revisions and they satisfy myself or the reviewers, then we'll go ahead and accept and publish your work. So minor revisions would be things like rewriting some minor sections, adding in some citations or some sources that you may have left out. Major revisions would entail running an extra study to add, recoding, all the old videos and rerunning all the analyses, so something really big. Right. And what the authors have to do at this point is they have to respond to the reviewers. Okay, so they actually get sent now the full reviews from each of the reviewers with all of their comments and critiques, and they have to respond line by line. So if, say, peer review person number 1 says, you left out this article, Smith 2010, which I think is really important, you should, incorporate that into your discussion, then the authors have to then respond to that critique. So they can either say, oh, good point, sorry we missed that, we have added it in, see section, the discussion section, see line 290. Or if they don't agree with whatever the comment is, you still have to respond, but you don't have to actually do it. So you can respond to the reviewer, thank you for pointing that out. After reviewing Smith 2010, we've decided that we are not going to add it for X, Y, and Z reasons. Okay, so you have to go through all of the reviews, the 3 reviewers, respond like that to all of them. Some of them may have contradictory advice, so one may say, reanalyze it this way, another person says that the analysis looks great. All right, so at that point, you respond to all of them, you make the best decisions you can as the researchers, and you send it back to the editor. Usually if it's minor revisions, the editor looks it over, makes sure you made the changes or responded to things if you didn't, and then makes their decision then to go ahead and publish it. If it's major revisions, it usually goes on to a second peer review process, where you'll get feedback again, and then another decision will be made at that point. So this whole process can take fairly long. It depends on the journal, it depends on the individual work that's being reviewed, it depends on the reviewer schedules, and so on. But just to give you an idea, I have 2 publications. One that took 3 years from, or about 2.5 years from submitting it to getting it published online. And the other one that took about 1.5 years from submitting it to getting it published online. Okay, and if we incorporate the actual time it took to do the study, that first one that I said would have been 5 years from starting to collect data to actually getting published, and the other one would be about 2.5 years, again, from starting data collection to getting published. All right, so it can be a fairly lengthy process, and so if you're reading current research that was published, say, last month, it may have been done years ago, okay? Because likely it took a while to actually carry out the study and then to go through this publication process. So what I want you to do before you come to class is to look at the handouts on APA format that are online, and when we come to class we're going to do an in-class activity or lab on APA format that involves a literature search. So we're going to focus on that first stage of this whole research process. All right, make sure to bring any questions with you to class and we'll answer them at the beginning.